Hey guys. Whenever discussions of Atlantis are broached on YouTube, it invariably invites an absolute poo storm. It's just one of those topics people pick a side about. Specifically, the channel Bright Insight has been promoting a theory that the Richat structure was the site of Atlantis. But in my opinion, this hasn't been researched very well. Today I want to have a real examination of this theory. Not just to draw conclusions, as it's totally up to you what you want to get from this, but to lay out the evidence and examine it without making too many assumptions. As I think a lot of these videos just turn into roasts of people rather than hypotheses, I'm going to be analysing the strongest parts of the theory and just ignoring the jankier or outright false bits. That is to say, I could just spend this whole video roasting Bright Insight, but I don't really want this to be a negative space, and it wouldn't actually help you in understanding the theory objectively for or against. The Richat structure was made millions of years ago in underground lava chambers, which were pushed up to the surface through tectonic movement and then collapsed in on themselves, creating these ring shapes. The general idea of the hypothesis is that once upon a time, these rings would have been filled with water, and the ancient Atlanteans would have built on these rings. Bright Insight is by no means the only person who's been promoting this theory. I mean, this lunatic even went to Mauritania, which is something I do not recommend. To properly analyse the theory, we're going to be divvying up the evidence into 4 sections: shape and measurements, material evidence, names and historiography, and geology. Now, this one kind of speaks for itself. Check it out, it looks like Atlantis. As well as this, Plato says Atlantis had shelter to the north and an opening at the south, which the Richat does. Additionally, he gives us measurements for the island of Atlantis, which are 127 stadia. Converting the stadia as 607 feet, or 185 meters, provides an overall measurement of 77,089 feet, or 23.5 kilometers, which compared to this section of the Richat, does give us pretty precise measurement. However, as has been pointed out many times, stadia vary quite a bit from 600 to 650 feet, meaning that this could be quite an erratic figure. On top of this, these measurements that are so often quoted are actually of the island of Atlantis itself. The city is given alternate measurements by Plato of about 27 stadia. Randall Carlson, like a big academic Santa, puts this size into context in this image on his podcast, which I'll link below, and yeah, it's a bit iffy. You could make the argument that these measurements would have been more accurate if this outer basin was filled with water, making this structure the island itself, and it actually seems like at one point it was. The Sahara itself goes through humid phases in which it's hit by large monsoon seasons, which consequently turn the Sahara into grassland. The last one of these phases began anywhere from 15,000 to 10,000 years ago, and lasted to about 6,000 years ago, at which point it turned back into desert. This would have been a prime time frame for modern theories on Atlantis, which generally place the civilization prior to the end of the last ice age, 11,700 years ago. During this time, the area around the Richat structure would have been fairly lush and full of animals with rivers flowing abundantly. The remnants of these rivers can actually be seen flowing into the basins. In fact, most of the artifacts found in the area have been washed into these rivers, indicating strong, consistent rainfall, and we can guess that maybe during one of these grassland phases, that these rings would have been parallel rivers. Going back to the measurements, however, it's all a little too semantic for me to book it as a win for either non-believers or supporters. Like, in what world are we really expecting Plato to have exact these measurements on an ancient island? But at the same time, they are kinda accurate. So I definitely understand the opinion that this was Atlantis. This is, for my money, the funnest bit and the most convincing. We begin with Bright Insight's assertion that the ancient Mauritania progenitor king was named Atlas, the very same name Plato gives to the founding ruler of Atlantis. Not only this, but on geographical reconstructions of maps described by Herodotus, we find the Atlantes smack bang in the middle of the Western Sahara. Herodotus is actually describing a people attached to the Atlas Mountains here, but it's still mighty suspicious. But outside of Wikipedia, how do we know that the progenitor king was named Atlas? As far as I could tell, this is mentioned first in our surviving evidence by a man named Diodorus Siculus in his massive synthesis called Bibliotheca Historica, in which, as far as I could understand, Diodorus sources a history in which he turns mythical figures into historical ones. Here he says Hercules and Atlas became buddies, and Atlas taught Hercules all of his astronomical knowledge, which was so great that when Hercules returned back to Greece, they thought Atlas had changed the astronomy game so significantly that he literally had the sky on his shoulders. Hence the Atlas Titan myth, where he's holding up the sky for all eternity, was born. Not only this, but further on in his work, Diodorus Siculus further describes people of Atlantis and their war with the Amazons, and it seems that he actually places Atlantis and the Amazons both on the African continent. Later, he almost explicitly places Atlantis adjacent to the Atlas Mountains. Here's a quote from Siculus. After the death of Hyperion, the myth relates, the kingdom was divided among the sons of Uranus, the most renowned of whom were Atlas and Cronus. Of these sons, Atlas received as his part the regions on the coast of the ocean, and he not only gave the name Atlanteans to his people, but likewise called the greatest mountain in his land Atlas. As for critiques of the evidence, I haven't actually seen much refuting the written stuff. Of course, all of this does have the issues inherent to ancient texts, but honestly, I really like whatever's going on here, and I think it's super interesting. Okay, so it looks like Atlantis, and it sounds like Atlantis, but where are the remains? The main theory has a two-pronged attack to explain the location of material remains of Atlantis. First of all, the documentary Visiting Atlantis, which did visit the Richat structure, is quoted. The documentary found a bunch of stone tools and copper tools collected by locals. And of course, that channel that visited Mauritania did find a lot of similar items. Critics of the theory, such as the channel World of Antiquity, have pointed out that not only is no reference provided for any of the artifacts, but also that their seeming lack of identification is not evidence that they are from an ancient civilization. Okay, cool, so did anybody think to look what they actually are? Well, it turns out the Richat structure has actually been archaeologically surveyed extensively, back in the 70s by the Frenchies. A man named Theodore Monod was brought in from Wizard Woodstock and worked around the rim of the Richat, finding evidence for extensive Paleolithic and Mesolithic stone tool production, which would explain the masses of stone tools at the site. As for bronze artifacts, African metallurgy is actually a fiercely debated topic and riddled with a lot of that other cultures couldn't do anything until the Europeans got their mindset. World of Antiquity finds a date for the Saharan metal trade of 400 AD, but I managed to find some official carbon dates for bronze smelting in Mauritania of about 800 to 300 BC. Although to give you an idea of how prevalent the aforementioned mindset is, dates as early as 1100 BC were obtained in the 70s in the same area, but dismissed by the excavator because they were too early in comparison to the rest of the material they were finding. All that said, 800 BC or even 1100 BC is not an Atlantis timeframe. The stone tools have been identified as Acheulean, however you pronounce that, which was a stone tool style that began over 1 million years ago and lasted up to 100,000 years ago. And the sheer mass of them paints the picture that stone tool production in the area was abundant and probably took place during one of those luscious grassland periods. However, there's nothing really out of the ordinary here, just some very productive hunter-gatherers. So what about buildings? Well, Bright Insight actually brings this up and points out that there are a lot of stone structures throughout the Sahara that are missing identification. Actually, he's not wrong. The Western Sahara is actually full of stone structures, and archaeology in Mauritania and the Western Sahara in general is so untouched that most of them are yet to be put into typologies or dated. That being said, some of them have been excavated, and the oldest one I could find was from an old cattle grave. While these things can get pretty massive and a mystery in their own right, to me they're not really indicative of what we're looking for, and archaeological typologies are starting to be applied to the period, and it looks like that phase of Mauritania was its own distinct cultural group. The other argument is that any evidence, such as buildings, would have been washed away by something called the Younger Dryas impact. This impact is a theorized comet that slammed into the Earth and ended the last ice age 11,700 years ago, and would have caused mass flooding, theorized to have resulted in our flood myths, including that of Atlantis. This is a fine hypothesis for other areas of the world in which no human remains are found, but as demonstrated, we have a lineage of remains from well before the Younger Dryas. That is to say, it's incredibly unlikely that thousands of stone tools would stand like the gates of Mordor against constant tsunamis, while all traces of a city gets washed away, leaving only a stone axe. Okay, we'll keep this one short and sweet, but it essentially boils down to the fact that the Richat structure is now 120 meters or 400 feet above sea level, when Atlantis was supposed to be a coastal city. And to the point, I can find no evidence that the Richat was ever at sea level in a reasonable time period for Atlantis. Supporters of the theory have drawn parallels with other continental shifts across the planet, which can certainly be rapid. But the fact is that there is no geological evidence that indicates that anything similar happened in West Africa for literally millions of years. Randall Carlson himself was not able to find any evidence, and if Randall can't find anything, I don't think there is anything to be found. The only real evidence I see brought up is the large quantities of salt throughout the area, but unfortunately this is rock salt from 1,000 years of erosion and not dried up sea salt. Okay, so where does this all leave us? Well, now you've got the knowledge, so you tell me. In my opinion, it seems unlikely considering the relatively consistent archaeological record, which for me is something that usually trumps written stuff. The image painted by the archaeology is that the Richat structure was a prime hunting ground, in which people were able to produce a large stone tool industry. But that said, I really like the stuff about Atlantis in the ye olde texts, and there very well could be something in that. Anyway, I hope this helped if you were interested in this topic on either side. Regardless of your opinions about it, I think it's such a fun subject, and I hope you enjoyed it. Anyway, thanks for watching guys, subscribe if you enjoyed, and have a lovely day.